The biting wind howled, a relentless, predatory sound that seemed to chew at the very foundations of the old fire lookout tower. I watched, or rather felt, as the world outside vanished into a churning vortex of white. Snow, thick and wet, plastered itself against the tiny, ice-rimmed panes of glass, piling higher with each passing minute. I'd only been here, perched atop Mount Cinder, for a week, assigned to this remote outpost in the Alaskan wilderness for what I hoped would be a long, undisturbed stretch of solitude. After everything, the quiet was supposed to be a balm, but this wasn't the quiet I'd sought. This was the crushing, absolute silence of a world erased by a blizzard, punctuated only by the shriek of the wind. I traced a finger over the frosty glass, my breath misting in the frigid air of the cabin. The stove in the corner offered little comfort against the encroaching cold, its warmth clinging only to the immediate vicinity. Days ago, when I'd first arrived, the view had been breathtaking, an endless sea of frosted pines stretching to distant, jagged peaks. Now there was nothing but a blinding, suffocating curtain. The trail back down, my only link to anything resembling civilization, was long gone, buried under what must have been feet of fresh snow. I was truly alone, and the thought, which had once been a comfort, now began to prickle with something akin to unease. My gaze drifted to the two-way radio on the small wooden table. It was my sole lifeline, a relic of a bygone era, its battered casing and yellowed knobs speaking of decades of use. It had been mostly silent since I'd arrived, save for a brief, crackling check-in with the regional office a few days prior. They'd warned me then about the incoming front, but this was more than a front. This was an early winter assault, a full-blown whiteout that promised to lock me in for weeks, if not months. The wind suddenly intensified, rattling the entire structure. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. And then it happened. A sharp burst of static erupted from the radio, loud and sudden in the oppressive silence. I flinched, my hand instinctively going to the volume dial. It wasn't the usual low hum of background noise. This was a violent, almost violent burst, like tearing fabric. Just as quickly as it came, it was gone, leaving only the sound of the storm. I stared at the radio, my brow furrowed. Must be interference from the blizzard, I reasoned, trying to calm the sudden tremor in my hands. The old thing was probably just acting up. But then it came again, fainter this time, a distorted hiss that seemed to waver on the edge of comprehension. I leaned closer, straining to hear over the wail of the wind. And through the static, impossibly, I heard it. A sound, low and guttural, like air struggling through a constricted throat. Breathing. My heart hammered against my ribs. Breathing. But whose? There was no one else within 100 miles. I grabbed the radio's microphone, my voice rough. "Hello? This is Lookout 7. Is anyone there?" Only static answered, a mocking, empty sound. I waited, holding my breath, until the only sound was the incessant shriek of the wind and the dull thump of my own pulse in my ears. I put the microphone back on its hook, my eyes fixed on the radio, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The blizzard raged for the next 2 days, a relentless, suffocating force. I spent my time trying to conserve fuel, rationing my meager supplies, and staring out into the opaque whiteness, a gnawing sense of isolation settling deeper into my bones. Each time the wind briefly abated, a new burst of static would tear through the air, followed by that same unsettling sound, the breathing. It grew clearer with each instance, more distinct, less distorted. It was deep, ragged, almost resonant, as if something large was struggling for air just outside the thin walls of my sanctuary. I tried to rationalize it. Animal sounds, maybe? The wind playing tricks with the ancient electronics? but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It wasn't the random huffs of a bear or the desperate gasps of a trapped deer. It felt like something was there, a presence I couldn't see, obscured by the endless falling snow. On the third night, after another prolonged blast of static and a particularly chilling series of wet, ragged breaths, I heard something new. A faint, almost imperceptible scratch. It was soft at first, a delicate rasp against the exterior of the tower, just beneath the floorboards. I froze, my body rigid, listening intently. The wind outside roared, making it difficult to pinpoint. But then it came again, clearer this time, a steady, rhythmic scraping. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It sounded like something was dragging long, sharp claws across the wooden planks, or perhaps digging. I grabbed my lantern, its dim beam casting dancing shadows across the cramped cabin. Moving to the small trapdoor in the floor that led to the lower storage level, I hesitated. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to stay put, to not investigate the impossible. But the other part, the part that was rapidly succumbing to the gnawing paranoia, demanded answers. I lifted the trapdoor, peering down into the gloomy darkness. The only sound was the howling wind and the frantic beat of my own heart. No scratching, just the cold, dead air. I closed the trapdoor, my hands trembling. It must have been the wind, I told myself, just the wind, carrying debris, mimicking a sound that wasn't there. But the logical explanation felt flimsy, a thin shield against the growing terror. I spent the rest of the night hunched by the radio, willing it to remain silent, yet dreading what I might hear if it did. Sleep offered no escape, only fragmented nightmares of being buried alive, of skeletal hands reaching through the snow. The days bled into one another, marked only by the escalating horror. The scratching became louder, more insistent. It moved, sometimes seeming to be against the walls, sometimes against the roof, but always just out of sight, just beyond the reach of my lantern's beam. I'd press my ear against the cold wood, trying to identify the source, but the instant I moved, the sound would cease, only to resume moments later from a different location. It was as if whatever was out there knew my every movement, toying with me. Then came the voices. At first they were indistinct, muffled whispers woven into the static, like fragments of a distant conversation. I dismissed them as tricks of the mind, the product of extreme isolation. But they grew clearer, slowly, terrifyingly. They weren't coherent words, not exactly, but rather distorted echoes of human speech, overlaid with the guttural breathing. And one afternoon, during a brief, eerie lull in the storm, a phrase, unmistakably clear, cut through the static, sending a jolt of ice through my veins. He mourns, the little one. My blood ran cold. The little one, my daughter, the personal tragedy I'd tried to escape, the reason I'd fled to this desolate place. How could it know? How could anything know? I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair, my mind reeling. My daughter, who I'd lost just months ago, a wound still raw and festering. Only a handful of people knew the true depth of my grief, and none of them were in a 100-mile radius of this frozen hell. The scratching intensified then, a frantic, desperate rhythm against the outer wall, directly beneath the window. I scrambled to the small window, wiping away the condensation with a trembling hand, but there was nothing to see but the swirling, endless white. The blizzard was a perfect, impenetrable screen. Over the next few days, the radio became a tormentor. The bursts of static were almost constant, and the breathing was now a deep, rattling gasp, punctuated by wet, slurping sounds. The scratching became a furious, clawing assault, vibrating through the tower's frame. And the voices, They started referencing other details of my life, intimate, personal things no one should know. My old dog, a childhood nickname, a specific argument I'd had with my brother years ago. Each revelation chipped away at my sanity, leaving me trembling and gasping for air in the dim light of the cabin. It was learning, mimicking, and it was doing so through the veil of the blizzard, never showing itself, never giving me anything solid to fight. One evening, as dusk bled into night, the radio crackled with a new intensity. The breathing was directly in my ear, it seemed, close and horrifyingly real. Then, a series of distorted sounds, a high-pitched wail, a child's sob, her sob, my daughter's. I clamped my hands over my ears, tears stinging my eyes, but the sounds seemed to penetrate my skull, vibrating through my very bones. I squeezed my eyes shut, picturing her face, her bright, innocent smile, now twisted into a sound of pure agony. It was a cruel, sadistic mockery, designed to shatter me. "She misses you, Daddy." A voice, eerily familiar yet warped and guttural, whispered through the static. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound torn from the deepest part of my being. I grabbed the old axe I kept for splitting firewood, my hands slick with sweat, and stumbled towards the door, intending to burst out into the blizzard, to face whatever monstrous entity was playing these vile games. But as my hand reached for the latch, a new, sickening realization washed over me. The scratching had stopped. The breathing, too. The static, for the first time in days, was gone. The radio was utterly, completely silent. The only sound was the fierce, unending howl of the wind outside. I froze, my hand hovering over the door latch. The abrupt silence was more terrifying than any sound had been. It was the silence of something waiting, something that had achieved its goal. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the axe heavy in my trembling hand, listening to the deafening roar of the blizzard and the frantic pounding of my own heart. Days passed in a blur of terror and exhaustion. The radio remained silent. The scratching never returned. But the dread, a cold, unwavering presence, never left. I peered through the frosted windows, my eyes scanning the endless white, convinced that at any moment a distorted face would materialize from the swirling snow, or a clawed hand would scrape against the glass. The blizzard finally broke on the 7th day. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the sky began to clear, revealing a landscape utterly transformed. The mountain was buried under an impossible amount of snow, drifts piled higher than the lookout tower itself in places. The world was a pristine, unbroken blanket of white, untouched by footprints, unmarked by any sign of the impossible thing that had haunted me. I looked at the radio, now just a silent, inert box on the table. Was it all a hallucination? The product of isolation and grief, amplified by the harshness of the environment? I wanted to believe it, desperately. But the memory of that voice, so personal, so venomous, still echoed in the deepest recesses of my mind. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a blinding glare across the snow, I felt a familiar shiver. It wasn't the cold this time. It was the chilling understanding that the blizzard hadn't been a barrier, it had been a veil. And whatever was out there, shrouded in the static and the snow, had learned all it needed to know about me. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting. And I was still here, high atop Mount Cinder, utterly alone, with the vast, silent wilderness stretching out around me, holding its breath.